In December 1886, on the Montana frontier, while others braced for winter, Dennis Corbin was digging his cabin floor 3 feet down. The town called it a grave with windows. His pregnant wife and son waited inside as he sank the floor and buried a rope from door to barn. They said he'd lost his mind. But when a whiteout erased the world, that grave became the only thing anyone could find. Was it madness, or did he see what was coming? Dennis Corbin was not a madman. He was a homesteader scraping a life from the Montana frontier in 1886, a year before the Great Die-Up would kill hundreds of thousands of cattle across the northern plains. Winter on that open prairie was not a season. It was a predator. Families who relied on wood walls and prayer often didn't see spring. So when Corbin lowered his cabin floor 3 feet into the earth and ran a rope to the barn, his neighbors saw a grave. They had no idea he was building the only structure that would survive the coming whiteout, and the only compass that would lead them home. The Montana frontier in 1886 was not a place that forgave mistakes. A man could break his back clearing 60 acres of rock and sage, build a cabin with his own hands, and still lose everything to one wrong decision when the thermometer dropped. The land around the Judith Basin was especially cruel. Open prairie stretched for miles without a single windbreak. No hills, no tree lines, nothing to stop a winter gale from scouring the earth clean. Homesteaders learned quickly that the cold could kill in a dozen different ways. Drift snow buried doorways overnight. Chimneys iced shut while families slept. Men wandered 50 feet from their barns in a whiteout and were found frozen days later, hands still reaching for something they never found. Everyone who survived out there did so by following the same unwritten rules. Stack firewood high. Build snow fences. Keep a rope line between the house and the barn. And never, under any circumstances, lower your cabin floor into the ground where the frost could trap you like a coffin. Dennis Corbin broke that rule deliberately. He had arrived in the basin 2 summers earlier with a young wife named Alice, a boy of 7 named Caleb, and another child already growing beneath Alice's ribs. The Corbins were not greenhorns. Dennis had spent years working railroad camps and mining claims across Idaho and Colorado. He had seen men freeze to death in their sleep because they trusted wood walls to hold back a wind that had traveled 500 miles without touching anything solid. He had also seen something else, something that stayed lodged in his memory like a splinter. Outside a mining camp in the Sawtooths, an old prospector had built a dugout shack with a floor sunk 4 feet into the earth. That winter, when a 3-day blizzard buried every other structure under 10-foot drifts and collapsed half the camp roofs, the old man had walked out of his dugout with a shovel over his shoulder and a pipe still lit between his teeth. The snow had piled high above his sod roof, but inside, the temperature had never dropped below 40 degrees. Dennis never forgot that. So when he staked his claim in Montana and began building the family cabin, he did something that made every other homesteader stop and stare. He dug down. Not just a root cellar, not just a shallow trench. He lowered the entire cabin floor 3 feet below the surface of the prairie. The walls still rose above ground, but the windows now sat just inches above the frozen grass. From a distance, the cabin looked like it was slowly being swallowed by the earth. The roof line barely cleared a tall man's head. The doorway sat at the bottom of a short slope, as if the whole structure were kneeling into the ground, bracing for impact. The neighbors rode past slowly on their wagons, reins held tight, expressions unreadable. Some shook their heads in silence. Others did not bother to hide their contempt. A cattleman named Harlan Cross stopped his horse one afternoon, watched Dennis lever another rock from the pit, and laughed out loud. "You building a house or digging a grave, Corbin?" Dennis did not answer. He kept swinging the pick, steady as a metronome, while Alice watched from the doorway with one hand resting low against the weight of her unborn child. But the floor was only the first strange thing. The second was the rope. Dennis buried a heavy hemp line in a shallow trench running from the cabin door straight to the barn, 40 feet away. The rope was anchored deep at both ends, covered with just enough dirt to hold it in place, but shallow enough that a man could feel it through the snow with his boot or his bare hand. Every morning, Dennis walked that line, packing the soil down again, checking the tension. Caleb helped him, small hands pressing the earth flat, learning the path by heart. To the other homesteaders, it looked like obsession. A rope buried in the dirt would freeze solid in the first hard frost. Snow would cover it completely. What use was a guideline you could not see? But Dennis was not thinking about seeing. He was thinking about the kind of storm where you could not see your own hand in front of your face. The kind of whiteout where even the barn disappeared 2 steps from the door. He had seen that storm before, too. The first real test came in late October, a full month before anyone expected serious snow. A cold front rolled down from the Canadian plains, driving a hard, dry wind ahead of it and a wall of white behind. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. Most homesteaders barely had time to bank their windows. The storm only lasted one night, but by morning, several cabins had drifts halfway up their doors. The Harper place, 2 miles north, had lost its entire wood pile beneath a ridge of hardpack. Old man Harper spent half the next day digging out his axe handle. Dennis Corbett's cabin, sunk in its earthen bowl, looked different. Snow had indeed piled up around the walls, but not against the door. The wind had swept up the sloping entry and curled over the roof, leaving the doorway clear. Inside, the temperature had stayed noticeably warmer than outside, even after the fire burned low. The ground itself seemed to hold the heat, radiating it back through the floorboards like a stone warmed by a long-gone sun. Alice noticed it first. She walked barefoot across the planks that morning and stopped, looking down. The wood did not sting her soles the way it had in their old cabin. Dennis did not say a word. He simply walked outside, found the buried rope with the toe of his boot through 6 inches of fresh powder and followed it blind to the barn. The rope held. Word traveled slowly across the basin, carried by freight wagons and the occasional rider. Most dismissed the results as luck. Harlan Cross told anyone who would listen that one mild storm proved nothing. "Wait till a real blizzard drops 4 feet on that hole," he said. "We'll be digging them out come spring." But not everyone was so certain. An old sheepherder named Virgil Tate, a man who had survived 30 winters in the Northern Territories and whose face looked like cracked leather left too long in the sun, rode over one afternoon to see the sunken cabin for himself. He did not laugh. He did not speak at all for the first 10 minutes. He simply walked the perimeter, studying the slope of the entry, the depth of the floor, the way the buried rope disappeared into the frozen soil. Then he crouched near the door, scooped a handful of earth, and let it sift through his calloused fingers. "Ground don't freeze past 4 feet," he said quietly. "You put your floor below the frost line, you got the whole earth working as your stove." He looked up at Dennis, eyes narrowing. "Question is, what happens when a whiteout drops 6 feet of drift on top of you and you can't push the door open?" Dennis wiped the dirt from his hands and nodded toward the rope. "That's why the line goes to the barn," he said, "and the barn has a door that opens inward." Virgil Tate stood slowly, stared at the rope for a long moment, and then did something no one in the basin had done yet. He nodded. November passed without major incident. December arrived with a bitter cold that froze the Judith River solid enough to drive a wagon across. The Corbins settled into their strange little home. Alice grew heavier with the child. Caleb learned to read by the light of a tallow candle while the wind moaned against the low-set windows. Dennis kept working, reinforcing the barn, cutting extra firewood and checking the buried rope every morning like a man visiting a grave. But the sky was beginning to change. The old-timers saw it first. Virgil Tate noted the way the snow geese had flown south a full 2 weeks earlier than usual. Harlan Cross, for all his bluster, quietly doubled the height of his snow fence. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The temperature hovered just above zero, day after day, without a single gust of wind. That stillness was the warning everybody knew but nobody wanted to name. It meant the storm gathering somewhere beyond the Canadian plains was going to be monstrous. And when it finally arrived, it would not be a storm at all. It would be a white darkness that erased the world. Then, on the morning of January 12, 1887, the sky over the Judith Basin turned the color of old iron. The temperature began to fall, not gradually but in sudden, violent drops that cracked fence posts and split tree bark. A low rumble of wind rose from the north, deep and continuous, like something enormous dragging itself across the prairie. Alice stood in the doorway of the sunken cabin, watching the horizon disappear behind a wall of white advancing faster than any storm she had ever seen. Caleb pressed himself against her side, small and silent. Dennis was already outside, making one final pass along the buried rope, pressing the frozen soil down tight with his bare hands. He looked up at the sky once, then toward the barn, then toward his family framed in the low doorway. His expression was not fear. It was the face of a man who had prepared for this moment his entire adult life and still did not know if it would be enough. He walked back to the cabin, placed both hands on either side of the doorframe and looked Alice in the eyes. "No matter what happens," he said, "do not open this door for anyone but me." Then the whiteout swallowed the sun. The blizzard did not arrive in stages. It arrived all at once, a solid wall of white that erased the barn, the fence, the sky, and finally the ground itself, until there was no direction left except the shrieking dark. Inside the sunken cabin, the Corbins huddled together beneath every blanket they owned while the wind hammered the low roof like a fist trying to break through. Caleb buried his face against his mother's shoulder. Alice held him tightly, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on the door that was already disappearing under a rising drift. The single window on the north wall, set just 6 inches above the frozen dirt, went dark within the first hour as snow packed against the glass. The grave, as Harlan Cross had called it, was beginning to feel exactly like one, but something strange was happening beneath the floorboards. Dennis pressed his palm flat against the planks and felt not the sting of frozen wood, but a faint, stubborn warmth radiating upward from the earth itself. The soil below the frost line was holding its heat like a banked fire. Outside, the temperature was 40 below and falling. Inside, without a fire, it was still just above freezing. Not comfortable, not safe, but survivable. That was the sliver of hope buried 3 feet down in the darkness. Dennis forced himself to think past the noise. The rope. The buried rope was still out there, connecting them to the barn. If the door could open, he could follow that line through the blind world. But opening the door meant risking the cold, the drift, the possibility of being swallowed by the white. He sat for hours, listening, waiting, while Alice's breathing grew more labored. She had not complained once, but he could see the strain in her face, the way she shifted her weight constantly, trying to ease the pressure building low in her back. He knew what it might mean. He was too afraid to speak it aloud. Near midnight on the first night, Alice gasped and clutched her belly. The pain was sharp, jagged, wrong. Caleb stirred and Dennis moved quickly, pressing his ear to her stomach, feeling the tightness through the thick wool of her dress. He had helped deliver a foal once, nothing more. There was no midwife within 10 miles, no trail to follow, no wagon that could cross the prairie in this white hell. The baby was not due for 3 weeks. If her labor was real, this cabin would become a tomb for 3, not just for 1. He held her hand and said the words that needed to be said, even if neither of them believed them. The false contractions, Braxton Hicks, the old women called them. They came and went across the second night, giving no promise of relief. Each time Dennis watched Alice brace herself against the edge of the low table, knuckles white, breath hissing through clenched teeth, and each time he felt cold fear tighten inside his chest harder than anything the storm itself could produce, because there was nowhere to go now. No doctor, no wagon trail, no chance of crossing the basin alive in a whiteout. The cabin had become its own isolated world, and its birthing room was a pit in the frozen earth. By the second morning, the world outside had become an abstraction. There was no sunrise, no pale light. The single window remained a slab of packed snow, glowing faint blue when the sun theoretically existed somewhere above the howling dark. Time dissolved into the rhythm of feeding the stove, counting the remaining split logs, and listening for changes in the wind's voice. Caleb had stopped asking when the storm would end. He had learned by now that the storm was not a visitor, it was the new shape of reality. Dennis sat with his back against the earthen wall, eyes closed, running silent calculations through his mind. The drift load against the north face, the snow pressure piling on the roof beams. The question of whether the door, already sunken below ground level, was now buried under 4 feet of hardpack or 6. If the chimney iced over, they would suffocate. If the roof collapsed, they would be crushed. If Alice went into true labor with complications, she would bleed out on the floor while he watched, helpless. He had prepared for the storm. He had not prepared for all of it together, but the earth held. Hour after hour, the soil beneath the floorboards remained stubbornly above freezing. The sunken cabin acted like a thermal battery, drawing up the deep warmth that no wind could reach. Other homesteads, he knew, would be burning through their wood piles at a desperate rate, the cold sucking heat straight through their walls. Here, each log burned longer. The air stayed dry enough to breathe easily. The grave was keeping them alive. On the third night, the wind changed register. Dennis felt it before he heard it, a sudden drop in pressure that made his ears ache. Then the howl outside lost its steady edge and began to break apart into gusts, long gaps of relative silence, then violent slams that shook the rafters. The storm was not ending. It was reorganizing itself. He had heard that sound once before in the Sawtooths, the night a secondary front rolled in and finished what the first had started. If he was right, the worst was not behind them. It was still coming. He made his decision before the next gust hit. He pulled on his coat, wrapped a wool scarf around his face until only his eyes showed, and tied one end of a 20-foot length of rope around his waist. The other end he secured to the heavy porch beam just outside the door, a safety line within a safety line. Alice watched him without speaking. She understood. He had to know if the buried rope was still accessible, if the barn was still reachable, if their lifeline still existed. He lifted the heavy wooden bar from its brackets and pushed against the door. It moved 6 inches before hitting packed snow. He dug with his hands, scooping the dry powder back into the cabin until the gap was wide enough to squeeze through. The cold hit him like a hammer blow. His eyelashes froze within seconds, but through the swirling white he could see the shallow depression where the rope ran toward the barn, a faint scar in the drift. He dropped to his knees, clawed through the snow with gloved hands, and felt the rough hemp beneath his fingers. It was frozen solid but intact. He gripped it and stood. 10 steps toward the barn, he lost everything. The world vanished. No cabin behind him, no barn ahead, only the rope in his hand, hard and real. He had experienced whiteouts before, but this was different. The snow moved so fast it erased all sense of motion. He could have been walking in circles and never known it. But the rope guided him true, 40 feet hand over hand until his shoulders slammed into the barn wall. He found the door, pushed it inward against a small drift, and stepped inside. The goat was alive, huddled in the corner, its breath steaming. The barn had held. The rope had held. For the first time since the storm began, Dennis allowed himself to believe they might survive. He followed the rope back to the cabin, and just as his hand touched the doorframe, he heard it. A voice. Human, ragged and distant, somewhere out in the spinning white. He froze, listening. It came again, a cry so faint it could have been the wind playing tricks, but he knew the wind. He had spent too many nights listening to its deceptions. This was not the wind. Someone was out there. Someone who did not have a rope, did not have a compass, did not have a buried line to guide them home. Someone whose minutes were numbered in single digits. Dennis stood at the threshold of the cabin, one hand on the door, the other still gripping the frozen hemp line. The safety rope tied to his waist would let him search maybe 20 feet from the door. But 20 feet in a whiteout was a needle in an ocean. If he lost contact with the main rope, he would die. If he did nothing, whoever was out there would die. He thought of Alice, of Caleb, of the child not yet born. He thought of the grave the neighbors had promised him. And then he stepped back inside, grabbed another coil of rope, and began tying the knots that would either save a stranger's life or lead him straight into the frozen dark. From somewhere beyond the drifts, the cry came again, weaker this time, and the storm answered with a roar that shook the earth. Dennis tied the knots with fingers already going numb. The second rope he looped around the buried main line and secured to his waist, creating a sliding tether that would let him range 30 feet into the white without losing his anchor. Then he knelt beside Alice, her face pale in the dim lantern light, and told her what he had to do. She did not argue. She did not have the strength to argue. She only placed both hands on his frozen cheeks and pulled him close enough to whisper against his ear. "Come back." Caleb watched from the corner, eyes wide. as his father pressed one last kiss to her forehead and stepped out into the screaming void. The cold swallowed him instantly. He moved hand over hand along the main rope, boots crunching through fresh drift, and angled toward where he had last heard the cry. The rope pulled tight behind him, a thin umbilical cord connecting him to the cabin and everything worth living for. At 10 feet, he stopped and shouted. The wind stole his voice. At 20, he shouted again. Nothing. At 25, the tether reached its limit, and he stood alone in a world that had been reduced to the sound of his own breathing and the endless roar of snow tearing sideways. Then it came. Not ahead of him. To the left. A cough so raw it sounded like a man choking on ice. Dennis reefed sideways, dragging the tether through the deep powder, and nearly tripped over the body before he saw it. The man was curled against the remnants of a broken snow fence, his arms wrapped around something small and shivering. Another person. The man's beard was a mask of ice. His eyes blinked slowly, barely conscious. It took Dennis a full second to recognize Harlan Cross. The cattleman who had laughed and called his cabin a grave now lay dying in a drift, clutching his 9-year-old daughter to his chest. She was alive, barely, her small face buried in the wool of her father's coat. Harlan tried to speak, but his lips were frozen together. Dennis did not waste words. He dragged the man upright, shoved the girl into his coat, and wrapped the tether rope around them both. Then he began the slow, brutal journey back down the buried line, one hand holding the main rope, the other gripping Harlan's collar while the storm raged against them. 20 feet. 10. The girl whimpered once, the most beautiful sound Dennis had ever heard, because it meant she was still breathing. When the dark shape of the cabin emerged from the white, the door open and Alice's lantern flickering inside, Dennis felt a sob rising in his chest that he did not have time to release. He hauled them inside and pushed the door shut against the drift. The temperature difference hit like a wave. The earthen floor was radiating its quiet warmth, and the girl began to shake uncontrollably, a good sign, the body fighting back. Harlan collapsed against the wall, his face a ruin of frostbite and shame. His frozen lips cracked open long enough to manage 3 words. Susan, my wife. She was still out there. So was the Harper boy and 2 others from the homesteads north of the creek. Harlan had led a small party to check on the Corbin place when the Whiteout caught them on the open prairie. They had scattered, lost their directions, and were probably still wandering in circles somewhere beyond the barn. 4 more lives out there in the dark. Alice rose slowly from the bed, one hand braced against her belly, and began boiling water. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Dennis read the truth in the way she moved, slow, deliberate, saving every ounce of strength for the battle still coming inside her own body. The child was going to be born in this storm, doctor or no doctor, and he was going to have to leave her again before the night was over. The grave had become a way station, and he was the only one who knew the path. He made 3 more trips into the white. On the first, he found the Harper boy, 17 years old and more frightened than he would ever admit, stumbling in circles 100 yards from the barn. Dennis lassoed him with the tether and dragged him back to the cabin like a calf from a snowbank. On the second, he found the 2 neighbors from north of the creek, a man named Grimes and his adult son, both of them nearly buried in a drift that had formed against an overturned wagon. They were so far gone that Dennis had to slap the younger man's face repeatedly just to keep him awake while they crawled hand over hand back down the rope line. By the time they reached the cabin, Dennis could no longer feel his own feet. But he still had 1 more trip to make. Susan Cross was still out there. Harlan tried to stand, tried to insist on joining him, but his hands were too swollen to grip the rope. He sat slumped against the earthen wall, weeping silently, a broken monument to every boast he had ever made about strength and sensible construction. Dennis pulled on a dry pair of gloves, the last he had, and stepped outside again. The world was beginning to change. The wind was still fierce, but the snow had lightened slightly, the density of the whiteout thinning just enough to see 3 feet ahead instead of none. The storm was finally exhausting itself, but it was a race between the clearing sky and a woman's body temperature bleeding into the frozen ground. He found Susan Cross half a mile from the cabin, lying on her side with her arms still extended toward the direction she had believed was home. She was unconscious but breathing, her pulse a faint thread against Dennis's fingers. He lifted her over his shoulder and followed the rope back one final time, counting every step, each one heavier than the last. The cabin was no longer a home. It had become a field hospital. 8 people crowded into a space designed for 3, the air thick with the smell of wet wool, wood smoke, and fear. Harlan held his wife and daughter against him, their 3 bodies forming a single breathing shape beneath a pile of blankets. The Harper boy was spooning broth into the Grimes men, while Caleb moved among them like a ghost, carrying cups of hot water and checking the rope that now lay coiled beside the door, a sacred object. And Alice was leaning against the low table, her face drained of color, her breathing coming in short, sharp gasps that she tried desperately to hide from the others. Dennis crossed the cabin in 2 steps and caught her just as her knees buckled. The labor was real now. There was no question. The false contractions had given way to something deeper, rhythmic, unstoppable. The old sheepherder Virgil Tate, who had been dragged in with the others that night, took one look at Alice and began clearing a space near the stove. He had delivered lambs in worse conditions, he said. He had never delivered a human child. Nobody else volunteered. The cabin fell into a strange, reverent silence while the wind continued to howl outside, lost and directionless, no longer a threat, just a fatting echo of the violence that had nearly killed them all. Dennis knelt beside his wife and held her hand while Virgil talked her through each contraction in a low, steady voice. The other survivors turned their faces away, offering what little privacy the tiny cabin could afford. Caleb sat in the far corner with the cross girl, telling her quiet stories about the buried rope and how his father had known exactly where to put it, and how they were going to be okay. The boy did not look at his mother. He did not need to. He was learning that day what it meant to be the son of a man who planned for the impossible. At dawn, the wind stopped. The sudden silence was so absolute that everyone in the cabin flinched. For 4 days, the roar had been the background of existence, a constant pressure against the eardrums and the soul. Now there was only the crackle of the fire, the shallow breathing of the exhausted, and the thin, piercing cry of a newborn drawing its first breath. Alice had delivered a daughter, small but furious, her tiny fists clenched against the cold world she had just entered. Virgil cut the cord with a knife sterilized in the stove flame, his gnarled hands trembling for the first time anyone could remember. Dennis wrapped the baby in a piece of blanket and held her up for Alice to see, and for a moment the grave was not a grave at all. It was a cradle, but the silence outside was not peaceful. It was the same held breath that had preceded the blizzard. Dennis felt it in his bones. He handed the baby gently to Alice and walked to the door. He dug the packed snow away with his hands, lifted the bar, and pushed outward. The light that flooded the cabin was blinding white, reflected off a landscape that had been completely rewritten. The sunken cabin sat in the center of a vast, sculpted drift. Snow had piled high around the earthen walls, but the entry slope had funneled the wind upward, leaving the doorway largely clear. Beyond, the prairie was a desert of white dunes, some reaching 10 feet high, burying fences, wagons, and the smaller outbuildings that had not been built into the earth. The rope line to the barn was hidden under fresh powder, but its shallow scar was still visible, a lifeline traced across the frozen sea. Smoke rose from the chimney straight upward into a pale gray sky, and the air inside the sheltered bowl around the cabin was so still that Dennis could hear the infant crying behind him through the closed door. He walked out to where the rope disappeared toward the barn and began digging. The other men, those strong enough to stand, followed him. They dug in silence, using their hands, a broken shovel, a piece of board. They uncovered the rope foot by frozen foot until the barn door emerged from the drift, still intact. The goat was alive. The storm had not beaten them. Dennis Corbin, the man who had dug his cabin 3 feet down into the earth and buried a rope to the barn, had not only kept his family alive. He had taught a blizzard where to break. Later that morning, when the basin was finally passable, other homesteaders emerged from their buried cabins and began the slow work of counting the dead. Not every family had been as prepared. The Harper family had lost their roof. The Grimes place was completely buried, but the people who had been pulled into the Corbin cabin, the skeptics, the mockers, the men who had called Dennis a fool, they were all alive. They stood in the strange calm of that sunken bowl, staring at the low cabin and the baby crying inside, and they understood that nothing they had believed about survival on the frontier applied anymore. Dennis had not built a grave. He had built the only thing that could save them from a whiteout, and when the next storm came, they would build their own. In the weeks that followed the great blizzard of January 1887, the true scale of the disaster became clear. Across the northern plains, temperatures had dropped to 60 below zero. Cattle froze standing upright in the fields, their eyes turned to ice. Entire ranches were buried under drifts so deep that spring floods uncovered bodies of men who had died reaching for barns they never found. By the time the thaw came, more than half the cattle in Montana Territory were dead, and hundreds of homesteaders had perished in the white darkness. But inside the low cabin that Harlan Cross had called a grave with windows, every single person survived. The Corbin family, the Cross family, the Harper boy, the Grimes men. All of them had walked out of the storm alive, and only one thing connected them: an underground floor and a buried rope leading home. The first neighbor to adopt the technique was the last one anyone expected. Harlan Cross spent the early spring clearing the debris of his own wrecked homestead, and then he did something that stunned the basin. He rode over to the Corbin claim with a shovel and a length of hemp rope and asked Dennis to show him how it was done. Not how to stack logs or raise walls, but how to dig down far enough that the ground itself became a blanket. Dennis walked the cattleman through the process without a word of "I told you so." He showed him the depth of the frost line, the angle of the entry slope, the exact tension needed on the buried rope so that even a child could follow it in zero visibility. Harlan worked in silence, his frost-bitten fingers still wrapped in bandages, and when his own sunken cabin was finished that summer, he did not call it a grave. He called it a sanctuary. Word traveled faster after that. By the autumn of 1887, a half-dozen homesteads in the Judith Basin had lowered their floors and buried their lines. The Grimes family rebuilt their place with a shallow entry trench and a rope spliced from old harness leather. The Harper boy, still rattled by his near death in the drift, spent his weekends helping older settlers dig new foundations. Even the old sheepherder Virgil Tate, who had no cabin of his own, became an evangelist for the method, riding from valley to valley with a coil of rope draped over his saddle horn, explaining to anyone who would listen that a 3-foot hole and a buried line could mean the difference between a funeral and a spring morning. The rope itself became known simply as the Corbin tether. Homesteaders began pulling waxed hemp through shallow channels between every building on their claims: barn, privy, root cellar. Well, each line an artery of survival. The concept was so elegantly simple that it spread beyond the basin entirely. Within 3 years, settlers in Dakota and Wyoming territories were adopting the technique, and by the early 1890s, the United States Army had taken notice as well. Officers at Fort Assiniboine, who had lost soldiers in whiteout conditions during the same blizzard that nearly killed Harlan Cross, ordered that buried guidelines be laid between all barracks, mess halls, and stables at northern frontier posts. The manual for winter operations was rewritten. A single man's obsession had become military doctrine, and none of it would have happened if Dennis Corbin had listened to the laughter. Alice recovered her strength slowly in the months after the storm. The birth had been hard, the conditions brutal, but the baby girl who had entered the world to the sound of dying wind was thriving. They named her Hope, a quiet declaration that the blizzard had failed to break their spirit. The old-timers who had witnessed the delivery swore that the stable warmth of the sunken room, the way the earth held its temperature while the roof groaned under 6 feet of drift, had saved both mother and child. A doctor who examined Alice the following spring confirmed it. The thermal mass of the surrounding soil had kept the cabin above 40 degrees even when the stove burned low, preventing the hypothermic shock that often killed laboring women on the frontier. Dennis had built the cabin for survival, but he had built a maternity ward without ever knowing it. Caleb grew into a young man who could read snow patterns the way other boys read school books. He learned to trace the ghost of the buried rope with his feet, to sense the subtle changes in wind pitch that warned of a coming whiteout, to trust the low cabin's ancient wisdom the way his father did. The boy who had carried cups of hot water to dying strangers in the dark became a man who never forgot the lesson of that January. When he married years later, the first thing he built on his own claim was a sunken cabin with a rope line to the barn. And when his wife asked him why he was digging the floor 3 feet into the earth, he said, "Because my father taught the storm where to break." The original Corbin cabin stood for more than 40 years after that winter. Season after season, the prairie wind scoured the landscape clean, burying fences, flattening lesser structures, but the low house in its earthen bowl remained. The roof was replaced twice. The floorboards were patched with new pine, but the depth never changed, and the rope line never rotted out because Dennis reburied it every autumn, a ritual he performed with the same quiet precision as a priest tending an altar. Travelers on the northern trails sometimes noticed the cabin from miles away, not for its height, which was unremarkable, but for the strange stillness around it. Even in high wind, the air near those walls barely moved, and the chimney smoke rose straight upward, a tiny defiance of the prairie's relentless power. One afternoon in the spring of 1901, a young reporter from the Helena Daily Independent rode out to the basin to interview the man the locals called Den of the Deep. He expected to find an eccentric old settler with wild theories about weather magic. Instead, he found a quiet man in his late 50s sitting on a porch that barely cleared the ground, whittling a cedar stake, while his wife hung laundry on a line that stretched to the barn. The reporter asked the question that had been on his mind the entire ride. Why dig down when every book and every expert said to build high and tight? Dennis set down his knife and stared out across the prairie for a long moment, long enough that the reporter began to wonder if he had been heard at all. Then the old man spoke. "The earth remembers the sun longer than the air does." That was all. No treatise, no argument, just a fragment of truth that had saved more lives on the frontier than any textbook ever written. But the deeper revelation came later, when a survey crew mapping the basin for a proposed railroad line stumbled upon an anomaly they could not explain. The buried rope running from the Corbin cabin to the barn, when excavated and measured, was found to be aligned not with true north, not with any obvious landmark, but with the prevailing shadow line of the wind itself. Dennis had oriented the lifeline so that even if a man lost all sensation and was driven only by muscle memory, walking straight into the teeth of the storm would carry him slightly offset of true danger, toward shelter instead of the open prairie. It was a calculation so precise that the surveyors assumed it had to be accidental. But the people who knew Dennis Corbin understood that he never did anything by accident. The legacy of the Great Blizzard of 1887 was written into the architecture of the northern plains. For a generation after that winter, every new claim in the Judith Basin began not with the raising of walls but with the digging of a floor. The old arguments about snow fences and wood piles gave way to new ones about frost depths and rope tension. Communities that had once mocked the sunken cabin now competed to build the most resilient ones, each family adding its own refinement: a deeper entry cut, a thicker thermal berm, a redundant line to the well. The survival rate during subsequent whiteouts climbed dramatically, and the winter of 1887 became the dividing line between the old frontier, which died in the snow, and the settled territory, which learned to endure it. Harlan Cross lived another 20 years. He never regained full use of his frostbitten hands, but he never missed an autumn ritual either. Every October, he could be seen walking the rope line on his own claim, pressing the frozen dirt flat with boots he could barely lace, a silent atonement for every laugh he had directed at a man who was simply smarter than him. The two families, Corbin and Cross, became unlikely friends, their children playing together under branches that had once been thin enough to snap in a man's hands. And when Harlan was finally laid to rest in the Basin Cemetery, his marker was a slab of local stone with a single image carved into it: a rope buried shallow, running toward a door. Alice Corbin died in the same cabin where she had given birth. She had watched her daughter grow, Mary, and build her own sunken home on the adjacent claim. She had watched her son teach his own children to read drift patterns and bury ropes. And in her final winter, when a mild storm blew through the basin and dusted the windows with a soft white powder, she sat by the stove with her husband beside her, and she said the thing she had waited a lifetime to say. "You were right from the beginning." Dennis did not answer. He simply held her hand and listened to the wind moving outside their low walls, broken, tired, harmless. The cabin in the earth outlived them both. It outlived the railroad, the telegraph, the first automobiles that bounced across the prairie on dirt roads. It stood through the winter of 1916, another historic blizzard that buried entire towns, and it stood through the winter of 1936, when temperatures plunged to 60 below and stayed there for a month. By then, the Corbin name had become legend, and the sunken cabin was a pilgrimage site for young engineers and agricultural agents who wanted to understand how a man with no formal education had beaten the weather at its own game. They came with notebooks and cameras, measured the floor depth, calculated the thermal mass, traced the route of the rotted rope line, and wrote papers that were filed away in state archives, where they would be forgotten again within a generation. The final twist, the detail that none of those researchers fully appreciated, was not the depth of the floor or the alignment of the rope. It was the fact that Dennis Corbin had never claimed to be an inventor. He had never spoken of his design as a breakthrough. He had simply looked at the way snow drifted against a fallen log, the way animals burrowed into the earth for warmth, the way the wind lost its voice when it passed through broken terrain, and he had reproduced what nature was already doing. The cabin was not a defiance of the prairie. It was an agreement with it. The grave with windows had never been a grave at all. It was the first honest conversation between a family and the forces that wanted to kill them. And when the conversation ended, the winner was not the man who shouted loudest. It was the man who had learned to listen. The quiet man from the Judith Basin never became a household name. His picture never appeared in the history books, and no monument stands where his cabin once sat. But the method he carved into the frozen earth, a sunken floor and a buried rope, saved more lives on the northern plains than any general or politician. It was a solution so simple that it took a historic tragedy for anyone to see it. The winter of 1887 killed thousands. The Corbins' cabin saved everyone inside it, and then it saved their neighbors, and then it saved their neighbors' children, and then it became the way things were done until people forgot there had ever been another way. What Dennis Corbin understood was not complicated. The ground holds warmth longer than the air. A rope buried shallow will not disappear even when the world does. A storm cannot break what it cannot find. These are not secrets. They are observations. But on the frontier, where survival demanded constant action, the hardest thing to do was simply stop and watch the wind move, stop and feel the soil breathe, stop and think about what the land was already trying to teach. Most people were too busy fighting the winter to ever hear its lessons. Dennis was the rare man who listened before he had to. We live in a world that still rewards loud certainty over quiet observation. We still build our defenses in straight lines against winds that curve. We still mock the ideas we do not understand, until the storm arrives, and those ideas are the only things left standing. The story of the sunken cabin is not just a frontier story. It is a story about how truth often looks like foolishness from the outside, and how the difference between a grave and a sanctuary sometimes comes down to 3 feet of dirt and a rope you cannot see. So the question that lingers is not whether Dennis Corbin was brilliant. It is whether you are willing to recognize the wisdom buried right beneath your feet before the whiteout comes for you. Because the next storm, whatever shape it takes, will not care about your excuses. Subscribe now to witness more stories of the forgotten pioneers who saw what others refused to see, until the moment they were all that was left.